Yat my relatives. This is Mark Charles. It is Tuesday, September 21st, and I'm sitting down once again with my second cup of coffee, and I want to talk about the recent horrific assassination of 10 civilians, including 7 children, by the U.S. military in Afghanistan. But before I begin, as I always do, I want to acknowledge that I'm speaking to you from what is now known as the lands of Washington, D.C., but these are the traditional lands of the Piscataway. And I want to honor and thank the Piscataway for being the indigenous hosts of these lands. I want to thank them for their stewardship of these lands. And I want to just publicly state how humbled I am to be living on these lands today. So there's a lot there's so many things going on right now around the country, around the world. If you're even paying attention, President Biden just spoke to the United Nations General Assembly today. I listened to most of that speech before I had a meeting, and I definitely want to talk about it later this week. I don't think I have enough to say something right now, but I definitely want to talk about a few things. My general impression of that speech was, I think that was a speech Joe Biden needed to hear, not one that he necessarily had the integrity to give, both as a person as well as the president of the United States of America, regarding our own history, not just hundreds of years ago, but a few months ago, a few weeks ago. So yeah, I'm putting some more thought into that, and I hope to address that later this week to talk about that speech. But last week, I, along with many of you, was devastated to hear that the United States military killed 10 civilians, including 7 children, as we attempted to assassinate someone who we thought was a terrorist and was planning an imminent attack against our soldiers in Afghanistan. And this not only was that a tragic thing to think about, but I've been pondering much more intentionally these past few weeks and even months the role of our white supremacy and racism in our foreign policy, and especially in our military conflicts going on around the globe, right? If we have these foundations that state this nation was built for white landowning men, and that people of color and natives and even women are all subhuman. And I've been talking, I wrote a book about how deeply this impacted our nation and how it's affected us domestically. But I'm now beginning to look more closely at, and I've known this is there, but I'm beginning to look more closely at what impact does this have on our foreign policy and on the ways that we interact with other nations, as well as the way we see ourselves as a part of this global community. And it's not a pretty sight, as you could probably imagine. But so after this attack, as I was kind of putting my thoughts together, I often use Twitter as kind of my kind of a testing ground of what I'm thinking about. And one of the tweets I gave was this one that said, the problem with drone warfare is that it makes killing people far too easy. And the ability to take life without any risk to your own is not only immoral, but dehumanizing, both for the victim and the perpetrator. Right? Our extensive use of drones to literally drop bombs, targeted bombs from out of nowhere on unsuspecting, oftentimes, frequently civilians, is we do this regularly. And even if it's not just Joe Biden, it's not just Donald Trump, even President Obama used drones extensively. And this allows us to further detach ourselves from the violence and the gore of warfare. And it makes immoral actions not only physically easier to commit, but even psychologically easier to commit, because it's almost like it's a video game. And we're losing touch very quickly with how devastating our actions are to the people who are on the receiving end of them, whether they're our enemies or whether they're innocent bystanders. The other tweet I gave was this one, and this was more a direct response to what happened in Afghanistan with the 7 civilians. And I struggled for a long time to know what to call it. The General McKinsey called it a tragic killing or a tragic mistake. A lot of news articles called it killings. And I decided to use the word assassination. And so I tweeted, the assassination of 10 Afghan civilians, including 7 children, by the United States military was not simply a tragic mistake. Rather, it is yet another example of the moral failings of the U.S. military-industrial complex. And I actually use the term assassination there. Assassination, right? It's the surprise, premeditated, targeted killing of usually a prominent figure. And had the targeted terrorist actually been the person in the car, we definitely would have referred to that as an assassination, at least if we had honesty about ourselves. And so the fact that it was somebody else in the car who was not a threat to the United States and actually was someone working alongside us, I still think we need to call it what it is, which it was as an assassination. Or maybe a murder would be another way to use it. I'm not sure, but I chose to use assassination in that tweet. And because I think we have to own what it was, right? It was a targeted killing. And just because we killed the wrong person does not make it any less of an assassination. And so I was pondering this, and I want to just share the article. There's numerous articles out there about these this attack and even the apology that General McKinsey and the U.S. gave. But I want to reference this one from Reuters, which was titled, "The U.S. says Kabul drone strike that killed 10 civilians, including children, in tragic mistake, is a tragic mistake." And this is this article is kind of interesting, and I just want to read a few parts to it. So in a statement, Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin said the drone strike had killed Mr. Ahmadi, who worked for a nonprofit called Nutrition and Education International. And he said, "We now know that there was no connection between Mr. Ahmadi and ISIS Khorasan, that his activities on that day were completely harmless and not at all related to the imminent threat we believed we faced." This is what Austin said in a statement. Went on to say, "We apologize and will endeavor to learn from this horrible mistake." So we want to use this murder as a learning point for us as a nation. Not saying we shouldn't learn from it, but this is how we're referring to it. And later in that article, General Mark Milley, who is the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, he appeared to blame the fog of war, even as he acknowledged in a statement that the civilian deaths were heart-wrenching. In a dynamic, and this is his quote, "In a dynamic, high-threat environment, the commanders on the ground had the appropriate authority and had reasonable certainty that the target was valid," Milley said. He didn't call it the fog of war, but the reporter, I think, accurately stated that he appeared to blame the fog of war. And he said we had the authority to do this, and we had a reasonable certainty to believe it, that that's who we were targeting. And so he's right. He's justifying this murder of civilians, including 7 children. We were acting within our authority, and we had certainty. And so therefore, what happened was not illegal. It may have been tragic, it may have been horrible, but it was not against the law, I guess is what he's saying, and appears to be blaming the fog of war. Now, if you've read my book, the book I co-authored with Singchan Ra, the 2 of the hardest chapters to read in that book are chapters 9 and 10, which talks about not only the white supremacy, but the ethnic cleansing and genocidal policies of President Abraham Lincoln. And we introduce the deconstruction of Abraham Lincoln's mythological legacy by talking about Robert McNamara, who was the Secretary of Defense. He served under General LeMay in World War II as an analyst, and went on to be the Secretary of Defense and was the architect of the Vietnam War. And in 2003, he was featured in a documentary titled "The Fog of War." And the fog of war it's a very interesting concept. I'm actually going to share a link here from the Wikipedia page regarding the fog of war. I looked up the definition of fog of war. There's a lot of different resources, a lot of different takes on it. I like the Wikipedia because it gives a flavor of a lot of different thoughts in it. And one of the things it says is that the fog of war is the uncertainty and situational awareness experienced by participants in military operations. The term seeks to capture the uncertainty regarding one's capabilities, adversaries' capabilities, and adversaries' intent during an engagement, operation, or campaign. It goes on to state that this term also applies to the experience of individual soldiers in battle. Often cited is the pure confusion of direction, location, and perspective on the battlefield. Officers and soldiers become separated, orders become confused and subject to revision with poor communication. Sound and visions are limited from the perspective of the individual and may not be easily resolved, resulting in a continuing uncertainty, a perceptual fog. This article also says the fog of war is a reality in all military conflict. Precision and certainty are unattainable goals, but modern military doctrine suggests a trade-off of precision and certainty for speed and agility. Militaries employ command and control systems and doctrines to partially alleviate the fog of war. And this is about the term fog of war as well, but the documentary we referenced was by Robert McNamara of the movie titled The Fog of War, where he's really wrestling with this. And I have no doubt that on the battlefield, just like in any traumatic experience or event, that there is confusion, there is a loss of awareness, there is even some fog within your brain, and decisions have to be made or things need to happen, but there's a lot of things inhibiting that from happening in a concise or a clear way. I do not doubt for a moment the reality of the fog of war. One of the things I'm beginning to question, though, is what happens when you acknowledge the reality of the fog of war, but you also deeply believe in the myth of American exceptionalism. And so what is the relationship between the reality of the fog of war and what that can lead to, and some of the tragic results it can lead to, and this mythological belief in American exceptionalism? And so when you have soldiers and commanders and generals and presidents and citizens who believe that they are exceptional, then what does the fog of war ultimately end up justifying? And I think one of the key statements that was made in this article is that there's a distinction between the fog of war, and it said this here: modern military doctrine suggests a trade-off of precision and certainty for speed and agility. So the fog of war would cause you or lead you to be less precise and slower to react to a perceived threat. But the trade-off is that you still are in a battle situation, and you still want speed and agility. And so there's a trade-off between how much do we justify, do we allow of imprecise, hastily made decisions and movements, while we're in this area of threat. And I think this is where the myth of American exceptionalism exacerbates the fog of war and uses it to justify unthinkable actions. One of the examples we gave in the book in chapter 9, right, was Robert McNamara and what he was talking about with the fog of war. And I want to share this with you. This is from the documentary. It's a clip from the documentary. I'm going to put this into the comments. And this is actually towards the beginning of the movie. And McNamara is saying, okay, any military commander who is honest with himself or with those he's speaking to will admit that he has made mistakes in the application of military power. He's killed people unnecessarily, his own troops or other troops, through mistakes, through errors of judgment, 100 or thousands or tens of thousands, or maybe even 100,000. But he hasn't destroyed nations. He goes on to say, and the conventional wisdom is don't make the same mistake twice. Learn from your mistakes. And we all do. Maybe we make the same mistake 3 times, but hopefully not 4 or 5. I want you to think about that. This is not some man who was in a battle and he shot a single civilian. That's not what Robert McNamara is referring to here. If you watch the rest of the documentary or if you read our book, when he was serving in World War II in the Pacific Theater under General LeMay, Robert McNamara was an analyst, and he analyzed the bombing raids of our bombers in the Pacific. And he reported that we were not very accurate because we were flying our bombers too high and the bombs were falling through the jet stream and we didn't understand the jet stream well enough. And so we were inaccurate. And so he suggested that we fly our bombers lower. General LeMay responded by, he was actually planning a raid called Operation Meeting House, which was the incendiary bombing of Tokyo. And he used some of that data to fly the bombers lower. And Operation Meeting House, the bombing of Tokyo, was the deadliest bombing in all of World War II, the history of the world. Even greater than Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Those killed 40,000 people at a time with the nuclear bombs. Operation Meeting House had a death toll of over 100,000 people, most of them civilians, women and children. We chose Tokyo because it was a wooden city and we knew it would burn hotter. The estimates of those died is actually hard to estimate because it burned so hot, it completely destroyed everything. And in his movie, in his documentary, The Fog of War, McNamara recalls a comment made to him by General LeMay, where he said, if we lose the war, we will be tried as war criminals. And Robert McNamara, in the documentary, agreed with him and said he was right. We were behaving as war criminals. And so when he uses this example of we all make mistakes, and yes, we all make mistakes, and maybe your mistake results in 10 people dying or 100 people dying or 10,000 people dying or even 100,000. And he said the conventional wisdom is don't make the same mistake twice. Well, maybe you'll do that too, but maybe don't make it 4 or 5 times. And this is a man who was complicit as a war criminal. Again, the reason he wasn't tried as a war criminal is not because he wasn't committing war crimes. It's because we didn't lose the war. It didn't change his behavior. It just meant he was never tried and convicted of war crimes. Does not mean he was not acting criminally. We absolutely were acting criminally in the way we were bombing the Pacific. Just because we won the war doesn't remove the fact that they weren't war crimes that we were committing. And I believe he's saying that was a mistake. He said, but don't make the same mistakes twice, right? But this is the same guy who not only was there that one bombing, Operation Meeting House, but there were numerous bombings, including, so we're talking casualties of tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, 300,000 people ultimately died to our bombing rates in World War II. And he's acknowledging that. Don't make it 2 or 3 times, but maybe don't make it 4 or 5. Right? But then, instead of being convicted as a war criminal and going to jail, or at least being dishonorably discharged, he leaves with honors and goes on to become the Secretary of Defense and becomes one of the chief architects of the Vietnam War, including authorizing the use of Agent Orange, which had devastating effects on not only our soldiers, but on the Vietnamese people. That can be felt even today. So when Robert McNamara is talking about the fog of war and learn from your mistakes and don't make the same mistake, maybe you will make it 2 times or 3 times, but hopefully you won't make it 4 or 5. Right? And he is talking literally from the experience of having made mistakes that cost the lives of hundreds of thousands of people. This is the slippery slope of what happens when you combine the reality of the fog of war with the mythology of American exceptionalism. Right? Had General LeMay or had his family or his country been on the receiving end of those mistakes, I'm sure he would have a much different perspective on what was and what was not allowable. And I highly doubt he would excuse those types of errors 2 or 3 times. But because he wasn't on the receiving end of those mistakes, because it was not his family that was dying, it was not his country that was being nuked, he was able to say, well, the wisdom says you learn from your mistakes. And yeah, maybe you kill 100,000, but hopefully you don't do it 4 or 5 times. And he did it at least 3, if not more. And right, this is the problem with our foreign policy that is rooted in this understanding that America is exceptional, chosen by God, and is superior because it was founded by the white race to especially other nations that are not white. And what this means, and this is where I want to talk about the fog of war, because yes, being in that that position can create a fog and can diminish your decision-making abilities and your actions. I don't deny that. But when you put yourself in that situation, because not that you're fighting there for just reasons, but you're fighting there for vengeance or vengeful reasons. And this is the challenge with the United States of America, is because when we go to war, rarely do we go to war for just reasons. We might have been unjustly attacked. We might have been unjustly provoked. But our reasons for going to warfare is not for justice. Right? After the bombing of Pearl Harbor, as well as the Philippines and many other of our outposts around the country. But we only focus on Pearl Harbor because that's where mostly white people live. We forget about the Philippines. This is thanks to this book I've been reading, right, by Daniel Amirwar about how to hide an empire. But anyway, after the bombing of Pearl Harbor, where we were attacked by Japan, we went on to bomb Japan, Operation Meeting House, and 2 nuclear bombs, as well as many other bombing raids throughout the city, extracting literally the lives of hundreds of thousands, not of soldiers, but of civilians. After the terrorist attack on 9/11, we went into not only a 20-year war in Afghanistan, but another war in Iraq, extracting the lives of tens of thousands of civilians. See, we have this belief because of our own exceptionalism that not only does the taking of an American life need to be brought to justice, but it needs to be avenged. Tenfold, 100-fold, 1,000-fold. And we go into such fits of rage and paranoid, in such fits of fear, that we create a fog of war, not because we're blinded for just reasons, but because we are so intent on extracting vengeance far beyond what was ever extracted from us. And this allows us to make risk assessments that result in not only the assassination of 10 civilians, 7 of whom were children, but the nuking of entire cities and 20-year wars against entire nations and other wars completely unprovoked, merely so we can extract our vengeance. And then we look back after we come out of these fits of rage and we say, okay, what can we learn from this? From the fog of war? Well, maybe we make that mistake 2 or 3 times, but hopefully we don't make it 4 or 5. Are you kidding me? So this is the challenge we're facing as a nation, is we literally believe, not only our military, but we've been told as U.S. citizens that our lives are worth more than the lives of other people. Yes, they can have drone strikes that come out of the blue, out of a clear blue sky, and bomb children in their playgrounds, in their cars, in their homes. Could you imagine what would happen if that ever happened to us? Could you imagine what we would do as a nation? Americans, we believe that other nations can live with that kind of fear. But if it ever happens to us, we will extract such a vengeance against those perpetrators that they will never think about doing such a thing again, or so we tell ourselves. We have to realize our lives are not more valuable than the lives of the rest of people around the globe. The myth of American exceptionalism is exactly that, a myth, and it's rooted in the lie of white supremacy. And so we have to do more than simply apologize, offer to make some financial payments, or at least let them know we're thinking about making financial payments, and then say we hope to learn from this. The problem is we are always the ones learning because we are always the ones committing these mistakes over and over and over and over again. Yes, the fog of war is a reality. But the myth of American exceptionalism and the lie of white supremacy uses the fog of war to justify our vengeful extraction of human life, including women and children and civilians around the globe, because we believe, we have been told, and we believe that the life of an American, especially the life of a white male American, is worth so much more than the lives of other people around the country, around the globe. And not only does the taking of an American life the perpetrators need to be brought to justice, those deaths need to be avenged. So anyway, these are the things I'm thinking about. And then on top of that, right, if you even read that Reuters article, the last statement closing the article, General Frank McKenzie played down the impact of the latest civilian casualties would have on future actions in Afghanistan and said, I don't think you should draw any conclusion about our ability to strike in Afghanistan against ISIS in the future based on this particular strike, he said. And today, in his address to the UN, President Biden reiterated, he didn't even acknowledge the fact that we assassinated these 10 civilians, including 7 children, in front of the General Assembly of the United Nations. But he did state that when confronted with terrorism, we will continue to assert our right. Now, he used the word, I think, to protect or to somehow, I forget what word he used. Problem is when we say we need to protect our way of life and our national interests, we actually mean we need to avenge anything done against us. And so it boggles my mind that literally less than a week after we acknowledged we assassinated these 10 civilians, and less than a month after we actually did this horrific act, that President Biden goes on the world stage, doesn't acknowledge it, and reasserts our right to continue to protect our way of life and our interests around the globe. The arrogance in his speech today was mind-boggling. Not only for that, but many other parts. And so, as we begin to wrestle as a nation, I'm sure there will be at least some more talk about our reparations paid to these families. What do we do? I wouldn't doubt some sort of financial payment is negotiated. But the problem is we're not going to deal, and we may try to say, well, what can we do so this doesn't happen again? But we're not going to deal with the underlying issue, which is not the fog of war. That's one issue. The exacerbating, the underlying issue that allows us to do this over and over and over again and just treat them as learning examples is the myth of American exceptionalism and the lie of white supremacy. And Donald Trump explicitly believed in that, and Joe Biden implicitly believes in that, and neither party, Democrat or Republican, has any interest in changing those parts of our foundations, which means they will continue not only to become a crucial part, a core part of our domestic policies, but they will continue to play a very crucial role in our foreign policy. This is why we have to address these things at a foundational level. Until we do, not only do we not have any integrity, but we don't even believe in these things. We don't even believe in the equality of everyone around the globe. The United States of America does not believe that, which is why we treat these things as learning experiences. instead of as a full stop. What do we need to do to make sure this never happens again? Anyway, these are my thoughts, my relatives. I hope that I'm hoping I'll have some time later this week to dissect a bit more of President Biden's UN speech that he just gave this morning. I appreciate you joining me for the second cup of coffee. I haven't been online in a while. I've been definitely pondering and thinking about a lot of things, but I haven't been online in a while. So I wanted to just talk about a few of these things today. And yeah, there's a lot of other stuff going on. I've been meeting with some people who I've been partnering with around issues of my campaign from 2020, as well as kind of my next steps moving forward, and hope to have an announcement in a few weeks about what I'm going to be doing more directly in the next year or so to kind of move this conversation forward beyond just my live streams and the stuff I'm doing on my social media. So we do have a few things that we're working on and trying to put together, and I hope to be sharing that with you in if not a few weeks, maybe, or a few days, maybe in a few weeks. Anyway, walk in beauty, my relatives. May we learn how to walk in beauty together. Thank you for joining me for my second cup of coffee. And